Once again to Fosu Inspire to the 8-part series of Introduction to Political Economy of Africa since Independence. Before we begin, I admonish you that if you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe or like our videos and leave your comments. Before we say anything else, let's take a deep breath and take a look at these two maps on our screen. The map on the left side shows major African states between the year 1400 and 1599. The map on the right shows European colonial expansion by 1900. These two images already summarize one of the biggest arguments of this lesson, that Africa did not begin with colonialism. Africa had states. Africa had rulers. Africa had systems of trade. Africa had political authority. Africa had organized society long before formal European conquest. So when some people talk about Africa, they speak as if Africa began with only when, or Africa began only when the Europeans arrived here, which is not true. Look at Mali, Songhai, Ethiopia, Congo, Buganda. All these were established states in Africa. On that map, you see states and society that existed across the continent. And these were not empty lands waiting to be discovered. These were organized political communities with their own system of power and economic life. And if you want one vivid example to understand this better, think of Mansa Musa of Mali. He's often remembered because of his extravagant or extraordinary wealth. But the deeper lesson is not just that one man was rich. The deeper lesson is that such wealth rested on an organized political economy control of what, of trade routes, a political economic system that had its ways of having that wealth through gold production, through taxation, and what imperial what administration. A ruler does not become globally famous for wealth by accident. That wealth comes from what, a functioning economic system. So it is not out of a fluke. So the first map tells us Africa had political and economic life before colonial life, and that before colonial rule, and that is what I want you to take away from the first map. The second map tells us that by the 1900s, much of the continent had been what, been bought be or partitioned under European control. So the question for this lesson, therefore, is not whether Africa had history before colonialism. Of course, it did, and this shows you that it did. The real question is, how did Africa move from diverse internal system to a colonial economic designed system, which was mainly for what? For extraction. That is why political economy is at the heart of this, seeking to understand this. So as a political economist or political economy, it's asking who has power, how wealth was produced, and how trade was controlled, and how those structures changed. Slides. We're looking at the pre-colonial and colonial political economy in Africa, where in this particular lesson, we are moving through two broad world. The first one is Africa before colonial rule, where we examined diverse economies, trade systems, political organizations, and the development debate. Then Africa under colonial rule, where we examine conquest, extraction, export commodities, and long-term legacies. So the key question you'd have to ponder over is that how did Africa move from a diverse pre-colonial system to a colonial economist built for extraction? This is one question that is going to be on our mind or lingers on in this lesson that we will seek to understand that perspective. And political economy will give us that illumination and that enlightenment in that regard. And note that we are not simply trying to tell a story of before and after. We are tracing a transformation. We want to see what existed, what changed, who imposed the change, who benefited from the new system, and what effect remained after colonial rule. And for you, maybe as an African, one thing I want to be very clear to you is that the purpose of this lesson is not just to mourn what was lost. It is also to recover perspective. Because a people who do not know what existed before dispute or disruption can easily what believe they had nothing. But Africans had something. In fact, Africa had many things: kingdoms, empires, trading cities, political institutions, and ways of what? Of organizing life. And you'd have to know that if you didn't know that. Certain objectives is that at the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain key features of pre-colonial African economy, describe how political organizations shaped economic life, be able to explain the political and economic logic of colonialism, analyze the economic and political legacies of colonial rule, and apply political economic analysis to Africa's historical experience. Please know that these are not passive objectives. They are active, right? Explain, describe, analyze, apply. That means you should not leave this lesson just saying, yes, I have heard of Mali, Sangai, or colonialism. You should leave and be able to explain why these matters in political economic terms. So for example, if I mention Mansa Musa, I do not want you to only say he was a rich African ruler. I want you to say his wealth reflected an organized state connected to what trans-Saharan trade and a control over what valuable what resources, especially gold. That is how a political economic student, or that is how, as you seek to link the politics and the economy or explain in that context, you should be able to what to say it, which seeks to make one understand that it was not just by he being rich, but it shows that he had the knowledge. They were able to build systems that was able to get him to that wealth. Now, roadmap for the lesson. We begin with pre-colonial diverse systems. Then we move to trade, both regional and global. After that, we will examine colonialism as conquest and control. Then we will discuss colonial policies such as cash crops and labor systems. Finally, we look at what legacies, meaning the development effects that continued after colonial rule. The main idea is very simple, and but very profound and powerful. Political economy helps us connect power, production, trade, and development outcome across times. So, in other words, the past is not dead. The structures of the past shape the possibility of the present. In other words, I mean, the past actually informs us to know what is ahead of us and what we are expected to do, our mistakes, so that we don't repeat them again and we do better. So when we later discuss things like commodity dependency, weak institutions, artificial borders, and political instability, we are not speaking about random problems. We are speaking about problems with history. Right. We look at pre-colonial African economics, which were diverse. One of the things that we must destroy is that idea of the lazy thinking or the lazy idea that Africa had one single pre-colonial economy is probably false. Is so false. You got pre-colonial African economies were diverse. When I mean they were diverse, it means that they were not doing one thing. They were different, and depending on where they were located, actually informs some of the things they did. So when I say they are diverse, some of the things that they were doing included agriculture, pastoralism, fishing, hunting, and crafts. And these were both from local, they had regional and long distance trade system. So this was basically from what that different ecological zone that was created with that created different economic what systems because they found themselves in different what zones, right? There was no one single African economic model. It was a farming society in the forest zone would not organize production in the same way as a pastoral society in the savannah or the coastal trading society connecting to the Indian Ocean because of their location where they find themselves, what habitat and the things that are available to them. I know this may seem obvious, but it's important because many weak arguments erase this diversity. Take the Swahili coast as an example, right? The coastal city states such as Kalwa and Mombasa were commercial centers connected toward the Indian Ocean world because of their location, right? These economics were shaped by what maritime trade, because where they find themselves located is how come they actually dealt with trade or what they were doing. Now compare that with inland agriculture society or cattle-based community. They may have to do other stuff because of where they find themselves, and they are not bothered by the sea, they are inland. So the point is not that one was superior, right? Because depending on where they find themselves or they're located will determine what they may be doing, right? So it doesn't show that one was superior in terms of its trade than the other. So the point is that they were different, and those differences what matter. Because you take Great Zimbabwe to the Great Zimbabwe is an important not only because it's an important not only because of its impressive stone architecture, but because it pointed toward an organized political and economic life in Southern Africa, including links to trade networks. So, people do not build enduring political centers and participate in regional commerce if they were what economically what empty. If those people basically could not do anything, they were empty, they could not reason, they could not have built what we are talking about, an inland trade could have not been able to be shaped by the maritime trade that no, they couldn't have been able to do that. So the point I want you to get from this slide is that pre-colonial Africa was not economically what empty or static, because we have to remember that that is important so that we avoid saying that Africa had no economy, that we help deal with that mischief or that idea that Africa had no economy. That statement is not just wrong, it is intellectually what lazy. Look at trade and production what systems. So in this particular slide, we're focusing on trade and the production system, right? Gold in West Africa, salt in the Sahara, textiles in markets, ivory and spices in East Africa, and craft in local production. So it is also it also reminds us that trans-Saharan trade connected West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean, whilst Indian Ocean trade connected East Africa to Asia and then the Middle East. So this is where we have the example where we look at Mali, Mansa Musa, becoming extremely what powerful. So Mali's wealth was tied to gold, to trade, and to its strategic what place in the wider what exchange what network. So Mansa Musa, a famous pilgrim to Mecca, became legendary not because he was just personally what extravagant, but because Mali was what was plugged in the commercial world and controlled valuable what resources. Let's think about salt. Like today, let's think about salt today. So as maybe in the modern day, you may hear about the term salt and feel like, oh, salt, how can you make money out of salt? But let's go back to those times. Let's imagine within those times and think about it. Salt was not ordinary in those times because many early society, salt was what essential for preservation and survival. And in that era, that is the reason why it made it a serious what commodity. So when caravans moved southward and go northward, what we are seeing is what a sophisticated what trade system, not a primitive void. No. So let us also move from there. Let's come to East Africa. The Swahili city states that traded across the Indian Ocean with the Arabs, the Persians, the Indians, and then beyond. So goods were moved, ideas were moved, people were moved. That shows that African society were connected to global exchange even before the colonial partition or the came, the colonizers came. And do not even forget the local production. But not every economy was built only on what long distance trade. Everyday life what rest on what agriculture, farming, livestock, weaving, iron working, poetry, and the local exchange. So a political economy does not need what an European what factors to count this as what as an economy or as a political economy. You don't need an European factors or fact to tell you that no, this is counted or this is seen as what an economy. Because production is what producing, exchange is what is exchange, and organization is what is organization. So we cannot come and change the narrative today that it was not so, but that was production, that was exchange, and that was organization. Because if you don't have that organization, you will not be able to have that trade system where you were able to trade with the Arabs, the Persians, the Indians. No. If you didn't have that sophistication, you will not be able to build that system that was able to trade salt even within. and do all those forms of iron welding, weaving, fishing, and livestock. No. Political organization shaped by economic life. This slide is one of the most important slides that we want to talk about, where we are saying that political organization shaped economic life. That in a centralized state such as Mali, Sangay, Ethiopia, and Buganda, rulers could collect what tribute, protect trade routes, and organize what redistribution. And when it comes to also a decentralized society such as the Igbo and then Somali settings, economic life depended more on what? On a kinship, council, clan authority, and then negotiated what? Rules. So the key point is that different political structures produce different ways of what? Controlling land, labor, trade, and what? And surplus. Take Shanghai, for example. A centralized system can collect trade, secure routes, protect authority, and build political order across what? Space, right? That creates one kind of what? An economic life for people, being able to do all this. Let's take the Igbos example in a more decentralized system. They may not have one single king commanding their whole political order, but economic life still function through institutions. Institutions then were working, lineage systems, market rules, and then collective decision making were also what? Working. So when you hear the word decentralized or decentralization or decentralized, you should not confuse that with disorganization or disorganized. And when you hear centralization or centralized, you should not automatically what? Assume what? Perfection. The serious point is that different institutions produce different economic what? Outcome. That is the point you have to leave here with or get out of this. That Buganda is another strong example. It had a, what? An organized what? Authority and could what? Coordinate political and economic life in what? In ways that affected production and distribution. Ethiopia too had what? A long-standing state tradition. These examples matter because they show how Africa's political history is full of what? Institutional what? Variety. So that you don't end up thinking that Africa had no institutions or Africa institution pre-colonial time didn't have institutions and then they weren't working. No. Africa had what? Varieties of what? Of institutions that were actually what? Working. That's where we ask ourselves that were pre-colonial economies underdeveloped. So now we are coming to the debate, or we are coming to a debate. The weak answer says that Africa was stagnant and waiting for Europe. That's a weak answer. I would say that's the false answer. Because that answer, for what we've just spoken about, that answer ignores evidence of what? Innovation, the trade we just spoke about, and the adaptation. And the strong answer is that pre-colonial economies had limits, but they also what? Showed innovation and expansion. So the issue is disruption, not absent of what? Development. If there's this distraction, it doesn't mean that there's an absence of what? Of development. And you have to know that this particular distinction is very what? Crucial and very important because every society has limits. The existence of the limits that exist in a society does not prove what? The absence of what? Of development. If we use the presence of limits as proof of backwardness, then almost every historical society would fail the test. So ask yourself, if Africa was simply stagnant and waiting, how do we explain the likes of Mali, the Mansa Musas, the Mali Empire, the Songos empires, Ethiopia, the Great Zimbabwe, the Swahili city states, the Bugandas? How do we explain those ones? How do we explain organized trade, tribute system, regional markets, caravan network, and internal political authority. So the weak argument collapses because the evidence is too strong to say that it, it was weak. So a better answer is this, that pre-colonial African society were developing on their own terms within their own ecological and technological context. But colonial rule disrupted, redistributed, and subordinated many of those trajectories. So this is the kind of answer that both intellectually would, for me, will be honest and historically grounded, because the history and the facts are there to show that Africa had a trade system. Africa had a internal political authority. Africa had systems that were working for them even before the coming of the colonizer. In today's slides, where we look at the transition to colonial rule. So we're talking about pre-colonial system of Africa, that Africa that existed even before the colonizers were coming. That's what I've told you how it looks like. How the Mansa Musas had a trade system, how the great Ethiopia existed, how the great Zimbabwe existed, how the Buganda existed. I've given you all these examples. I've spoken to you about how we were doing our things even before they came, that we had trade routes, we were doing agriculture, we were doing pastoralism, fishing, we were trading with the Indians, we were trading with the Arabs, we were trading on the Mediterranean. That shows you that we were already engaged even with the world. Now we are transiting, we are coming to a new or a transition to a colonial rule. So this slides will give us a simple timeline, as in European commercial expansion in the 1980s, the Berlin Conference of the 1984, where they sat down to partition and divide and share Africa among themselves in Berlin, where no African representative was present, where they were not aware of the ethnic divisions or tribes or different part of the culture that existed in Africa, and then just took pens and maps and just divided Africa anyhow they wanted and shared among themselves with Britain, with France, with Portugal, and the rest, and Germany and the rest. The conquest and the partition in 1890s and the foreign rule institutionalized by the 1900s. So the political meaning is clear, that colonialism meant the loss of Africa's sovereignty and the imposition of foreign political authority. This particular sentence should stay with you, because colonialism was not simple culture exchange. It was domination. It was suppression. It was an idea to take over. It meant decisions about land, labor, tax, trade, and governance were increasingly made by foreign powers rather than African communities. So Africa lost its sovereignty. When European powers met in Berlin, as I said earlier, that they were not consulting African people as equal partners to do that. They were dividing territories and just doing what they like. That is why the resulting borders often reflected imperial bargains more than African political reality. So colonialism was not just a key chapter in trade. It was a political takeover. It was a great political master plan with deeper economic consequences that actually the Africa had to live with, or at a point bear in that particular timeline. Now, we want to look at the objectives of the colonial economies. So the objectives were straightforward: extract raw materials, export them to Europe, supply European industries, import manufacturing goods, and then integrate Africa's territory unequally into what the world economy. So the core argument is quite plain that colonial economies were not designed mainly for Africa's development. They were designed to serve the imperial economic interest. That is the heart of colonial political economic arguments. So the basic question was not how do we build a balanced and prosperous African economy for Africans. No, that was not the question. That was not what they were pondering over. The basic question was how do we organize? What they were asking themselves was how do they organize these territories to serve imperial needs effectively? That is why colonizers often became exporters of cocoa, coffee, cotton, rubber, minerals, and other raw materials, whilst importing manufactured goods from Europe. Africa was importing from them. So the system was like this: we needed cocoa for our industries in the likes of Sweden and the rest to be able to manufacture them and create jobs, right? We needed the likes of the gold, the rubber, the coffee to create the best of coffee in the lives of Germany, the lives of Britain, the lives of the Americans, right? And then after that, we send those coffees back. We allow the same people to import those same manufactured copies that we added value to back to their country. They buy with their money, then we take their money. So it was more like a cycle that has been engineered and done to help boost their economy, their industries, and then make that part of the colonies an export or renter of or export or renter of of raw materials. And get to know that this particular pattern did not encourage deeper industrialization inside African territory. So they did not advance or they did not promulgate industrialization in Africa. No, because if they did that, how would those cocoa, those minerals get to being exported? No. So that means Africans also need the same minerals to be able to manufacture stuff. So if that is so, they made it, you make them a raw material producers. So that was the idea. So if you want basically more like a simple line to remember, it is this: colonial economies were designed outward, not inward. They were built to send wealth out. That's how the African system was designed by the colonizers. That they built a system that is meant to send out resources out for them, but not a system that is supposed to build inward for them. No, that was not it. And then colonial economic policies. We're going to look at some of the policies that they did on the backdrop of what we just did from their side. So as we're looking at these economic policies, right, we're going to look at cash crops such as cocoa, coffee, tea, and cotton were promoted. So they promoted that these are things that, so you find some of these commodities on the commodity exchange prices, where there are prices for products such as cocoa, coffee, tea, and the rest. You may not have you will not see cassava there. You're not going to see plantain there. You're not going to see tomatoes there. You're not going to see other things that may be found in Africa, right? But because these are the essential ones that are important for them, these are the ones that have been engineered that you find to see as cash crops that were promulgated, that was advocated for Africans to engage in or to do. Then taxation, which created a forced monetization and a cash need. That because you'd have to pay tax to the colonizer, if you don't have the money, that means you have to work for it. So that means you may even find a land to do some labor and then do the coffee, do the tea, which you may end up getting more of these things to also export them. Transportation systems were built what around rail and ports. So it was in a system that was meant to help send these kind of materials straight to the port and to the places where they are going to what, ship them to their countries, the Germanys, the Portugals, the Britain. So you realize that labor system included what, forced labor and what, uh, it will include forced labor. Yeah, the trade was what, externally what, oriented, which was meant for them. Yeah, and infrastructure was served what, extraction. So infrastructure was solely based on the basis of what could actually help advance the extraction process of how to extract the resources from Africa. So these revenues served what, the colonial what, states. And note that those are not what, separate policies. They work what, together. Those policies you are seeing here, cash crop, taxation, labor, they are not separate policy. They are linked together. They're all linked to meant to achieve something. That's why when I was explaining them, I was linking them. Because when you do a cash crop, what will happen? We're able to engineer the economy to a cash crop. You need railway lines to export those cash crops from the hinterlands, the places where they are farmed. So let's build one that leads to the port, that leads to the places for what, extraction. If you are doing cash crop, you need labor. So let's do a tax system that will let the people at a point they have to pay tax, so they'll have to work, so they'll have to engage in some of these things. So they find a system like that. So it was a well-engineered, connected system together. So they were not, as you're saying, they are linked, they are intertwined, they work together. Because taxation will push people into what? Into the money economy. And then the crops what production what ties communities to what? To export what markets. Then the labor system would mobilize what workers for what, for plantation, mining, and what, and settler what, farmers. The infrastructure will help move the what, the product out. So the revenue will help what, sustain what, colonial what, administration. Basically that. So the colonial administration, what it means in this instance, they are using the same people's own money to fund how they govern the people. So they're not taking money from outside, from the, no, the same people's money, and they are still benefiting from them. So let's take taxation. If a colonial state says you must pay, let's say, tax or a hand tax or a poll tax in cash, then people need what? Money. If you need money, then you are what? You be forced into what? Into wage what? Labor or what? Export what? Production. Well, that is how the policy reshaped every life. So take labor system. In some places, labor was what? Violently what? Coerced. People were violently coerced to what? To engage in labor so that they were able to produce some of all these things. So in other words, you find migrant what laborers what drawing men away from what? From home or their communities to work in the mines or settler what agriculture. And this is not just this particular system just did not just affect the economy. It affected what? Household, gender roles, and what? And social reproduction. So colonialism was not only what? A military conquest. It was also policy design. It was economic pressure and what? Institutional what? Restructuring. So it was a system that was meant to restructure the institutions to what? To serve the colonial system. Even after colonialism is done, it's still serving them, right? And there's this economic what? Pressure, and there's this what? Policy design that was embedded into the African system to help what? Feed and what? Advance the colonial what? Agenda. Infrastructure for extraction. And this particular image on my right hand side, like right left hand side, basically is profound and then says it all. The colonizer did not build roads and railway for Africa during the colonial period. The roads and railway were channels of extraction to loot minerals, resources, and take them overseas. So this slide shows one of the most misunderstood part of colonial rules and infrastructure. Railway and roads often link mines and farms to the port, but they did not always connect African markets to each other. So the railway lines was not built to connect the likes of Ghana and La Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana and Togo, Nigeria and then Chad, Nigeria and maybe Burkina Faso. No, to boost intertrade among Africa, that was not it. Because if you're going to boost intertrade among Africa, how they get the resources? That means the resources are going to be linked around Africa. No, that was it. So they created this long-term kind of partnership of outward looking trade, and then infrastructure map that was done shaped that later developmental choices that existed, because there wasn't infrastructure that was meant for intercity trade. It was all for an outward system. And people sometimes assume that because colonial powers built railway, they must have been developing Africa. But as I said, that is too simple for you to say. Because infrastructure must always be judged by purpose. What was the aim? What was the goal of the infrastructure? So infrastructure for whom? Infrastructure for what? If a railway is designed mainly to move copper from a mine to the port, or cocoa from a production zone to the coast, that helps extraction. It may not help balancing national development on the African continent or where those resources are. It may not integrate internal market. It may not connect African producers to each other in ways that support border based growth. No. So here the key issue or the key line over here is that not all infrastructure is developmental intended. Some infrastructure is extraction in design. And I repeat, some infrastructure is extraction in design. And that is why many post-colonial economic inherited transportation systems that looked functional. They looked functional, but were poorly suited for integrated internal development for those people or even within the continent. Now we move into Africa's case study. Different developmental colonial strategy. So this particular slide is very important because it teaches us how to analyze real cases. So we have the Gold Coast, which is Ghana. In pre-colonial, it was referred to as Gold Coast, which is Ghana, now present day Ghana, Kenya, DRC Congo, and Nigeria. So the guiding question that we're using for this is that what was produced? And beneath is the guiding question, like what was produced? Who controlled labor and land? Where did profit go? And what structure was left after independence? These are the questions of a political economy that we want to ask, we want to understand. And as we look at these particular examples, so you are not just memorizing names of colonies. You are asking how each colonial system worked. So in the Gold Coast, we see a cocoa-based peasant economy. In Kenya, we see a settler agriculture and land Hellenization. In DRC Congo, we see mineral extraction and forced labor. In Nigeria, we see cash crops and regional specialization, where these people were oriented into producing certain crops that is meant to help, and those things, that was how it was engineered. So the point is that colonialism had a common extractive logic, but it was not identical everywhere. That's one thing you have to put in mind. It was not identical everywhere. Different territories were used in different ways, and the structure left behind were therefore different too. So, and you may realize that some of these colonies had different things. Congo was based on what mineral extraction or minerals, right? And you find issues of forced labor and all those that were there. So it gives us that particular perspective of this particular different what colonies that existed. And then narrowing down now on the Gold Coast, which is Ghana, cocoa and export dependency. I'm going to use this case study as I've taken out of it for you to understand better when we talk about this country case study specific. So the Gold Coast is a very revealing example for you to understand that cocoa became central to what to export ending and rural livelihood, right? Smallholder production was linked to what global markets. So export dependency created what vulnerability to what to price shocks, and then the colonial what economy what shaped post-independent what fiscal what choices. So because the country's um, economy at the point was tied with cocoa, when we had even gained independent, because the lands were already growing cocoa, you're all doing this. So fiscal choices itself were sometimes were more like already shaped on the basis of cocoa. And this case is useful because it shows that colonial economies were not all based on what identical labor system. In the Gold Coast, African farmers played an important role in cocoa production. But even with the African smallholder involved, the wider structure still what pushed the economy towards what export dependency. So the main success in producing one export crop will still become what a trap for you, because if too much state revenue and too much rural livelihood depend on cocoa, then a fall in global prices will create what a national problem. So even fast forward to current day modern Ghana, where they saw a fall in cocoa prices had an impact on cocoa farmers. And after post independence too, they experienced the same thing. That is the danger, and that is how the system has been structured. So the lesson is not simple that cocoa was vulnerable. The deeper lesson is that commodity dependency would shape policy what choices, budget, and long-term what vulnerability. Moving to expand upon some of our case study already is that in Kenya, what we experienced was that settler agriculture created what land inequality and made land a major political issue after independence. And when it comes to DRC Congo, mineral extractions and coercive labor, which I mentioned earlier, created what a violent extractive what economy and resources what fueled what power struggle. And when you go to Nigeria, cash crops and what regional specialization shaped what uneven development, and later oil what deepen the resource what politics now existed in Nigeria. So these examples are quite important because they show you how colonial rule left different kinds of scars on these particular different uh, countries. So Kenya teaches us that land is never just soil, land is power, it is belonging, it is livelihood, and it's a political what conflict. When it comes to DRC Congo, it teaches us that when an economy is organized around violent extraction, that logic can persist long after colonial rule. And even now, after colonial rule, you still see that kind of a violence in terms of having kids still in the minds of certain places in Congo. It still persists. And Nigeria's case shows us that regional specialization and later oil politics can deepen uneven development, and it intensifies the struggle over revenue and control. So again, what I want to understand is that colonialism did not create one uniform African experience, but it did create what recurring patterns of dependency, inequality, and external oriented production. economic impact of colonialism. So this slide basically is summarizing the economic impact of colonialism, the distorted structures, the dependency commodities, the limited industries, uneven regions, and then valuable shocks, the vulnerable shocks that exist. So the key point is that colonialism did not only take resources, it reorganized production, trade, and infrastructure in ways that shaped post-independent world development. And this is very important, or is an important or profound statement, because colonialism was not just thief or thievery. It was restructuring. It was what distorting structures meant, or that means that the economy was organized around what imperial what priorities. The economy was engineered to suit the colonizer what they wanted. And dependency commodity, when I say dependency community, it means that too much reliance on what on few export producers. That's what I mean by dependency commodity. When I talk about limited industry, it means that the colonizers did not develop strong manufacturing sectors over here in Africa. You realize that they didn't build industries. No, they didn't care about that. They only made sure that you export more outside, the raw materials outside. So industries were not invested in on the continent. And uneven regional means that some areas were favored because they served colonial interests, whilst others were neglected. So you have some areas who were doing the cocoa production, who were having maybe oil, who were having the coffee, were giving certain infrastructure that was leading to a port and all those kind of stuff, building certain schools and all those kind of stuff. While the other places where they felt they were not getting resources from were neglected. And the vulnerable what shocks means that these economies became what highly sensitive to what changes in world prices. So they built the economy around what they wanted, their world price, the world market price that they designed. So the moment there's a shock to that, and maybe you have an estimate of a money that you're expecting that, oh, I'm producing maybe 100 tons of cocoa, I'm expecting this. If that happens, it affects your estimate, it affects your budget and your planning as a country. So when today a country struggles because the world price of its major what export force, that problem often has a deeper what historical what roots. It's not from today. And we move into political legacies of colonial rule. We've looked at the economic ones, we're looking at the political legacies of colonial rule. So colonial rule also what left political legacies. These included what centralized but often weak what states, artificial borders, which is spoken about, and what divided communities, authoritative governance tradition, and then post-independent what instability and legitimacy what problems. The simple meaning where this lies once is to give is that the colonial state was built more for control than what accountability development. That means that the colonial state was often good at commanding or commands, taxation, and coercion, but it had weak was weaker in what in legitimacy, or the people did not accept that. It was weaker in what accountability, and it was weaker in what in social what inclusion. When we say artificial boundaries, it matters because colonial powers often drew maps without deeper regards for what older political realities, and this created what states with territorial what territories were fixed but not always politically what integrated. And some of the wars in Africa, or the conflict we have, is out of some of these issues that were created by the colonizer. And then authoritative tradition also what matters, or it means that if colonial governance was top bottom and coercive, other institutional habits could continue after independence. So some of the institutional habits that we may blame the system that exists, we have to understand that some of these institutional habits came from the colonial time. That we have to look at history and have to deal with some of these institutional habits that existed because of how the colonial structure was. So when we later study coups, instability, legitimacy crisis, and governance challenge, we should remember that some of those problems were inherited through the colonial system with state reforms, or the state forms, or how the states were formed or designed by the colonizers when they came. So as we come to a close to our end, some of the discussions and reflections that I would want us to look at is that, were pre-colonial African economies under development, or simply we say different? How did colonialism reshape Africa's production and trade? Which colonial legacy most affect Africa today? Commodity dependency, boundaries, institutions, or inequalities? Which country best illustrate what colonial political economy? Some of these questions is to help us to reflect on what we've done with the course. So if I answer the first question, I would say pre-colonial African economies were different and diverse, as I said earlier, not empty and not stagnant. They had their limitations or their limits, as I said, but they also had institutions. They also had innovation and exchange, because they were doing trade. For the second question, which is colonialism reshaped Africa's production by directing it towards export commodities and reshaping trade by orienting territories towards orienting the territories outward towards imperial markets. That is how the colonial it shaped us, because it re-engineered our system to make sure that we are producing commodities or exporting commodities that was meant for the imperial market. For the third question, there is no single automatic answer I can give. In my personal opinion, some people will say that boundaries, others will say institutions, others will say commodity dependency. So the key is not guessing the correct word. The key is defending your choice with evidence. So if you choose boundaries, if you choose dependency, if you choose commodity dependency, or you choose institutions, what points, what examples are you going to back your point with? That is what you have to ponder over. Think about that. And for the final question, you can choose Ghana, Kenya, DRC Congo, Nigeria, or other strong cases. These are not the only cases that are examples or case studies for this particular cause that we're looking at. There are other ones you can also explore the literature for. As long as you explain what was produced, who controls land and the labor, where profit went, and what legacy remains, you've done basically a good job of this particular reflection. The key takeaways I would want you to leave with at the end of this, as we are coming to an end, is that first, pre-colonial Africa had functional and diverse political economies. Secondly, colonialism restructured African economies for extraction and export. And thirdly, economic and political legacies of colonial rule still shape developmental outcomes. And the last one, political economy, helps explain both historical distraction and present day continuity. If there's one big message I want you to leave with in this particular part 2 of Introduction to Political Economy of Africa since independence, one thing I want you to leave with is that Africa had real systems before the colonial conquest. And colonialism did not create Africa's history. It interpreted and reorganized it. So when we study Africa today, we must not speak like people with no memories. We must remember the kingdoms, the empires, the markets, the caravan routes, the trading cities, the agrarian systems, the institutions, and the achievement that existed before the conquest. At the same time, we must we must analyze we must analyze soberly how colonialism transformed those words or transformed those world and left structures that still shape the present day. This is the work of political economy to connect power, production, history, and outcomes. Thank you for following this lesson. And in the next one, we'll continue building this particular story. Consider of sending anything outside the shores of Ghana to any African country, to Asia, to America, to anywhere you want to ship to. You can reach out to DHL Aoshi Station. They are very good at what they do and they have the best customer service and are going to help you get it wherever you want to get it around the world. Thank you for watching this lesson. If this video helped you, please kindly subscribe to the channel, like the video and share it with others. Your support helps this educational platform grows and it motivates me to keep producing useful content for students and learners across Africa and beyond. Thank you and see you in the next video.